Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we are looking at the last portion of Revelation chapter 14. This passage describes two harvests of the earth. The first one performed by one like a son of man, which could well be code for Jesus himself. And the second one a grape harvest performed by an angel with a sharp sickle. The second harvest continues the motif of the wrath of God as wine, in that the grapes that are harvested are thrown into a great winepress of God's wrath and then trampled into a remarkably large volume of blood. Blood is a term that could refer to the juice of grapes routinely, but the blood of the grapes continues a motif of blood introduced by the martyrs who cry out for vengeance for their spilled blood all the way back in the fifth seal of Revelation chapter 6. Thank you for joining me as we examine the treasures in Revelation chapter 14, verses 14 through 20. I want to go through a brief outline of the whole chapter. This chapter has these disconnects in it, this editorial interruption in the middle, and the beginning and the ending not seeming to be really in continuity directly with each other. So I wanted to give a bit of an overview outline of Revelation 14. I read it this way. In verses 1 through 5, during the persecution of the beast that's being described in the previous chapter, in chapter 13, 144,000 Christians gather on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. I read that as a tangible gathering of Christian people in the literal city of Jerusalem on Mount Zion, at least in the vision. We have to understand that this is a visionary experience, and so what occurs in a vision is always representative of something, but it is still in the vision, the physical city of Jerusalem that these 144,000 are in. In verses 6 through 10, three angels fly over the gathering of Christians, delivering messages of reassurance and of affirmation that the kingdom of the beast will fall and that those loyal to the beast will suffer for their evil. In verses 11 through 13 is then that editorial aside, in which John and the Spirit address the reader directly, contrasting the eternal torture of those who worship the beast with the eternal rest of those who die in the Lord. When it says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on," I don't think we are meant to understand the "from now on" part to only begin in the future when the beast is reigning, and at that eschatological moment, then the people who die in the Lord are blessed. No. This is a direct statement to the reader or listener of the book. Those who die in the Lord are blessed from now, right now on. So it is not something that we only look forward to in the future, or that those who die in the future can look forward to. All Christians from any point on are blessed if they die in the Lord. And then this last section, verses 14 through 20, in which the earth is harvested twice. The first time, it's a wheat harvest performed by one like a son of man. And the second time, it is a grape harvest performed by an angel from the heavenly temple. The grape harvest is put into a winepress of God's wrath, creating wine, which is also described as blood, to cover a huge area up to the bridles of horses. And I do believe there is a little bit of a disconnect here in that what we read about at the end of this chapter, two harvests of the earth, I don't know that they are something that the 144,000 are necessarily witnessing or aware of in their presence. I want to read through both of these harvests before I talk about any details in either one of them. That's because there are bits of details that come up that are common to both and some distinctive uniquenesses to both, and it's hard to discuss just one of them without referencing the other. So Revelation 14, verses 14 through 16 is the first harvest. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud was seated one like a son of man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to the one seated on the cloud, "Send out your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." And the one seated on the cloud swung his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, Revelation 14, 17 through 20 is the second harvest. And another angel came out of the temple that is in heaven. He also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, who had authority over the fire, went out from the altar. And he called out with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Send out your sharp sickle and harvest the clusters of grapes from the vine of the earth, because its grapes are at their prime." And the angel swung his sickle into the earth and harvested the vine of the earth, and threw the grapes into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was stomped outside the city, and blood went out from the winepress up to the bridles of the horses, about 1,600 stadia. This first harvest is performed by one like a son of man. Is not described as an angel, just simply as one like a son of man, with a crown on his head, and of course the sharp sickle in his hand, and on a white cloud. We already saw the angel that was standing half on land and half on the sea in chapter 10 was also associated with a cloud. And this Son of Man is sitting on a cloud, which sounds a lot like Daniel 7. In Revelation, the only other reference to a Son of Man was when John saw the vision at the very beginning of one like a glorious Son of Man walking amongst the lampstands. That was in chapter 1. Verse 13 identifies the one like a Son of Man, and then there are several other verses about him. Chapter 1, the vision of chapter 1 and the Son of Man in chapter 1 is explicitly identified as Jesus. We know that the Son of Man in chapter 1 is Jesus himself as he speaks to John at the end of chapter 1. I believe this is also Jesus in Revelation 14:14, that the one like a Son of Man is consistently the Son of God, also Jesus, the Lamb, who is on this cloud, and he is the one who is going to reap. The one like a Son of Man is instructed to reap by this other angel. We have two sickles described and two kinds of harvests between the first and the second. We don't have any explicit identification for what kind of crop is being harvested by the first reaper. But the verb reap suggests a wheat harvest as opposed to some other kind of crop. The second harvest, the angel with a sickle is told to harvest clusters of grapes. Even though the phrasing is similar about the sickle, there it's not reaping, it's harvesting, and harvesting explicitly the clusters of grapes. So the second harvest is clearer, that we're talking about a grape harvest. The first harvest is not clear, but it does seem to be some kind of grain, wheat or other grain, that's being harvested by one like a Son of Man. I did a little research to find some pictures of different kinds of sickles. The difference between a sickle and a scythe is that a scythe is larger and usually requires two hands in order to sweep it through. It is more efficient at gathering grain because you can get a wider swath with every pass. The sickle is smaller, can be held in one hand and used with one hand. And there are different sizes, though, of those. Larger ones would be for grain reaping, and then the smaller ones would be used for cutting off the grape clusters. But a sharp sickle was used by both. There's one verse that I wish we had a lot more detail about what exactly is being described. and that is Revelation 14:16. The one seated on the cloud swung his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Okay, well, we know what that means if we're talking about a metaphor of wheat or some other grain. They collected sheaths of whatever grain they were. But what does it mean to reap the earth? What are we collecting here in practical terms, non-metaphorical terms? If we're going to take the metaphor of harvesting and turn it into a non-metaphorical prose description of what is going on in this moment, what would it be? It surprises me that rapture theorists don't associate rapture with this particular part of Revelation. Because if I was going to put it anywhere, it would be either with the two witnesses being called up to heaven, which I already mentioned that I think that that is indeed, and one telling of what is going on with First Thessalonians and Paul's assurance that the dead in Christ will rise and we will join them in the air. If I were a rapture theorist, how could you avoid seeing rapture in this? It is talking about Christ reaping the earth, and it's a very natural way to read it as Christ gathering people, gathering souls. And so how does it not fit the picture of rapture? And yet, I haven't read any commentary by any of the premillennial dispensationalists that I have read who associate rapture with this verse. And that surprises me. I'm going to explain why I don't necessarily think that what we're talking about is reaping people. And the second harvest is a particular reason why. If you try to find where in Scripture is a description of harvesting that might help explain this passage, give some light onto it, you're going to land in Matthew chapter 13, where Jesus tells a parable about a landowner with a crop who is sabotaged by an enemy who sows what are called tares in some translations, or darnel in other translations. I guess darnel is the technical modern term for a kind of weed that will grow alongside the wheat and steal nutrition from it and cause it problems. And you don't want that in your field. Matthew 13 spends quite a bit of time on this parable. Jesus tells the parable, actually tells other parables after it, and then the disciples come to Jesus later and ask him for an explanation. I think there's enough context from the explanation that we can kind of skip the telling of the parable in the original form and just skip to his explanation in order to get the idea of what he's talking about. Because he makes it very crystal clear in his explanation that he's talking about eschatology and the end of things. I'm going to skip to Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 through 43, which mentions a harvest at the end of the age. Then he left the crowds and came into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain the parable of the darnel in the field to us." So he answered and said, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. But the darnel are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age. And the reapers are angels. Thus, just as the darnel is gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all the causes of sin and those who do lawless deeds, and throw them into the fiery furnace. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The one who has ears, let him hear." Can I just point out, the one who has ears, let him hear, is one of those phrases we looked at a couple of times ago as a very Jesus way of ending a story in order to encourage the readers or listeners to think more about it. But here is the explanation for the parable of the fields and the tares or darnel in the fields. Clearly, he's talking about a harvest at the end of the age. And in this parable, he makes it clear that the harvest is of people. The seed are the sons of the kingdom, people who are maturing in the field. The darnel, or the weeds, the tares, are the sons of the evil one. So they're people. But is this parable of Jesus, and is this explanation, does it explain the two harvests in Revelation 14? I see some problems with trying to just align these two item by item. For one thing, in Revelation 14, we're talking about two separate events, one executed by the Son of Man with his sickle, and then a separate one. Yes, it's only moments later, perhaps, but it is separate. A separate one done by a different angel in a different moment. Whereas what he's talking about here in Matthew 13 happens all at once. They just harvest everything and then they sort it out after. In Matthew 13, the reapers are angels. In Revelation 14:16, it's the Son of Man. But there is a second harvest that is performed by one other angel. But only one, not multiple angels. And in the harvest of Matthew 13, the good and the bad are all brought in together and only sorted out after the fact. Whereas with the harvest in chapter 14 of Revelation, the good harvest of the grain is performed once and completed, and then a harvest of the grapes is performed second. I believe there are enough distinctions that we can say we cannot really rely on Matthew 13 to give us an exposition of what's happening in Revelation 14. The visions that John is having of this harvest are not the same exact match to what Jesus is describing in Matthew 13. They both use a metaphor of the harvest, but I don't think they are necessarily describing the same thing. Before I get back into Revelation 14, I want to pause for a moment on Matthew 13. Where in Revelation do we see what Jesus is describing in Matthew 13? I think the most direct association is with throwing those who do lawless deeds into the fiery furnace. That happens in Revelation 20, 14 and 15. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. That description of being thrown into the lake of fire matches Jesus' description of putting those who do lawless deeds into the fiery furnace. There is the difference of Jesus describing it as a furnace and John in the vision describing it as a lake, but there is still a fiery end point for these people who do lawless deeds. But assuming that those are then the same events, being thrown into the lake of fire is the same as being thrown into the fiery furnace, the rest of it doesn't seem to match. Where are the angels in Revelation 20 gathering people? What I'm getting at is that while the principles behind what Jesus is talking about are certainly present in John's description, that is, that there are people who are good influences in the world, they are the good seed, and then there are those who are evil, sowed by the devil, and they won't be judged ultimately until the end, at the time of the judgment. But the details of exactly how this is going to sort out are a bit different from how Jesus describes it, because Jesus describes it with a harvesting metaphor in Matthew 13, and John in Revelation 20 is describing it with a metaphor of being judged by a trial, if you will. So let's go back to Revelation 14 and talk about these two harvests. There are actually four figures. Three of them are called angels, and then we have the Son of Man. In verses 14 and 15, we've got, on the cloud was seated one like the Son of Man, and then there's another angel that comes out of the temple. And then in 17 through 18, we have another angel coming out of the temple, and an angel who had authority over the fire who went out from the altar. So I want to walk through these verses. This is Solomon's temple in the background. And in verse 14, we've got one like a son of man sitting on the cloud. You don't know how hard it was for me to find pictures that didn't have wings on the angels. And in fact, I ended up not using any pictures that were depicting angels for the other angels because they all had wings. I don't think angels have wings, so I did not use images that had wings. But this first figure is one like the Son of Man. I believe that is Jesus. Jesus is then joined by a second angel. It doesn't say where Jesus comes from. He's just there on the cloud. As the vision continues, John says in verse 14, I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on it was seated one like the Son of Man. It's just suddenly there, the white cloud with Jesus on it. But he is joined by an angel who comes out of the temple. And this second figure, this angel, introduced in Revelation 14:15, tells the one on the cloud that it's time to reap. I think it's very interesting to note how often other residents of heaven have commanding roles. Why doesn't Jesus just decide for himself when it's time to reap the earth? Why does he wait for this angel to come tell him it's time, the harvest of the earth is ripe? I am going to propose some explanation for what triggers this angel to tell Jesus to do it. The fact that Jesus waits for the angel to give him the go-ahead is, I think, telling. I believe this is one of those elements of the divine council where God is delegating some responsibilities to beings other than himself. He does not always do everything himself, but delegates some responsibility to others. And in this case, is responding to what the angel instructs him to do, to reap. How the angel knows that it's time is another question. But the angel delivers the message after coming out of the temple, and he instructs Jesus to reap. In Revelation 14:17, then, there is an angel that comes out of the holy place. I did some searches for an image of an angel holding a sickle. It was really difficult to find one that didn't have wings, of course. I was insisting not to use a picture of an angel with wings, so I continued to look. What I found, and the image that I used here for this slide, is a picture of Saturn, the Roman god Saturn, whom I didn't realize is often depicted holding a sickle because of some of the mythology surrounding this god of the Romans. That's the image I use, but I'm not meaning to represent that this angel is in fact Saturn, the god of the Romans. I'm just using it because it was a picture of a Roman-esque person with a sickle and no wings. So this second angel has the sickle. He comes out of the temple and is joined then by another angel who comes from the altar. I believe that this is the bronze altar that is outside of the temple, because the point of view of John at this point seems to be outside the temple, because he doesn't see the first two angels until they come out of the temple, and then he sees them coming out. So the point of view of where John is as he's describing these events seems to be some point outside of the temple, and he sees each one of these. And this is the heavenly temple. This should not be understood to be situated in Jerusalem on earth, because in verse 17, we read explicitly that this angel comes out of the temple that is in heaven. We've had little glimpses of the heavenly temple even before this chapter. So the fact that John's vision, while he is in heaven, is inclusive of elements of the temple, like lampstands and a golden altar and this bronze altar of sacrifice and the Ark of the Covenant, all of these things have been mentioned. This is not new to have the heavenly temple as part of the setting. The fourth figure, the third angel, comes from that altar to tell the second angel that it's time for him to reap the grapes. I think it is important to note that altar. I think the fact that this third angel comes from the altar is explicitly called out, gives us some clues backtracking to why the other two angels came out of the temple. I want to focus for a minute on what we have learned or read about these two altars before chapter 14. I think that's going to inform our understanding of chapter 14. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, which is the fifth seal on the Lamb's scroll, that describes the martyrs who are crying out for justice, for vengeance, because of the blood that has been spilt by those who are wicked. That is what we associate then with that bronze altar, are those martyrs underneath it who are crying out for justice. Then in Revelation chapter 8, verses 3 through 5, we have the altar of incense mentioned. And in that context, prayers from the saints mix with the fire from the altar. Then that angel who's in charge of that fire takes a censer, mixes the fire from the altar with the incense that is the prayer of the saints. He throws that to the earth. I believe that creates safe havens for the saints on earth prior to the trumpet judgments that will occur immediately following this censer being thrown to earth. Many people interpret that censer as bringing judgments on the wicked to the earth. I believe that instead, that censer is bringing havens of God's presence to the earth. Now, God's presence is a threat to the wicked, but is a comfort to the righteous. And I think the emphasis is on being a comfort to the righteous in this case. If you want to understand why I believe that, I'm going to point you back to the lesson that I taught on those verses of Revelation chapter 8, because I go into some Old Testament examples of the altar of incense and incense itself and the smoke of the incense and how that functions. So Revelation 8, 3 through 5, I believe is a focus on God's protection of the saints through the incense. Then in chapter 9, verses 12 through 15, we have the golden altar mentioned, but we have a voice from the golden altar commanding the release of 4 angels who are going to kill a third of humanity. This brings us in kind of a conjunction of the altar of incense, which is mentioned in that context, but also the vengeance that's being called for by the martyrs, because releasing the 4 angels is going to bring that ultimate vengeance against those that have martyred them. So this is what we have associated with the altars in the book of Revelation to this point. I'm going to add the parable of those 2 witnesses to the context here, because I believe that is also tying together with what we're going to see in this harvest. In Revelation 11:5, we see the 2 witnesses being protected by fire from heaven. So if anybody wants to harm the 2 witnesses, fire comes down from heaven and kills those who would harm the witnesses. To me, this sounds like it could be an echo of the censer being thrown down from heaven in Revelation 8 to provide protection for the saints in that context. But in Revelation 11:6, those same 2 witnesses bring plagues on the wicked, covering all the domains of creation. There's drought by closing up the heavens from raining. There are just all kinds of plagues on earth because of the 2 witnesses. They bring it on to the wicked. This seems very much like the martyrs' demand for justice. So the 2 witnesses in those 2 verses seem to embody the same principles of the 2 altars. The prayers of the saints mixing with the fire of the altar of incense, and then the demand for vengeance by the martyrs under the altar of a sacrifice on the outside of the temple. And all of this comes together then in Revelation 14. We've got 2 harvests, a grain harvest, which is not explicitly identified as to what exactly is being harvested, except for the metaphor of wheat, but we don't have whatever that is supposed to be identified. It's not clear what the grapes are, but when the grapes are pressed in the winepress of God, what is generated is the wine of God's wrath. Clearly, the grapes are representing something bad, but it's not really people. The people aren't being harvested. The grapes are going to be harvested. They're going to be trampled into wine. And then the wine is going to fill the bowls of the seven angels, who are then going to pour those bowls out on the earth, and then the people will suffer their torments. It is not exactly people, wicked people, who are the grapes, but their wicked deeds. Their wicked deeds are collected and trampled into wine and then poured out on the earth in the form of the pouring out of the bowls. That suggests to me that we should read backwards into the grain harvest the idea of righteousness. The grain harvest is the righteousness of the saints. The grape harvest is the evil of the wicked. It's the harvest of the consequences of that wickedness. He's going to pour the consequences of that wickedness back out on the people who performed it in the first place. The wicked deeds of the people of Babylon, in this case, have been gradually collecting like grapes in the vineyard. They grow over time and they get more ripe as time goes by, and there are more of them in the vineyard until there's just a point where the vineyard is full and it's time to harvest. And then you get the consequences of all of those deeds that have been building up. And every time somebody does another wicked act, a grape shows up on a vine, on the vine of the earth. And now all of that is going to be collected. All of the grapes that have come out as a result of all the wicked deeds that have been done, all of that's going to be collected. And then concentrating them into wine and then pouring them back out onto the wicked people, so that they reap the consequences of their actions. In a sense, I believe this is a metaphor of using the wine as the mechanism for letting the people reap what they sow. They have been sowing wickedness. God is going to reap it by harvesting the grapes that have been growing as a consequence of their wickedness, and then he's going to pour it out all on top of them. I don't think either one of these harvests are in the physical realm where someone can witness the harvest taking place. This is a spiritual reality of God gathering the sins of the wicked. And the metaphor is that the sins of the wicked are like grapes in a vineyard, and he's going to take them and concentrate them by trampling them in his winepress and then pour them out onto the very people who created the problem in the first place through their wickedness. When it comes to the wheat harvest, I think it is something comparable. Christ is reaping the good deeds of righteousness, which doesn't result in wrath, but rather in comfort and strength and endurance and the ability to endure. This harvest of the grain is about harvesting the righteousness of those who are faithful in order to provide sustenance for them, to sustain them through the difficult times. In a sense, this is one form of the deeds going on after them, as was mentioned in Revelation 14:13. Their deeds are going to follow after them. The deeds of the righteous are going to follow after them by providing for them sustenance, because Christ is reaping that good work. What's not stated is what he does with the harvest after he gathers it. But it's implied, I believe, that what he gathers from his harvest will become sustenance to sustain his faithful followers, as opposed to the grapes of wrath that are going to be trampled out and then poured out in the bowl judgments. I wanted to just make a couple of notes here about Revelation 14:19 and 20, the end of the harvest of the grapes. And the angel swung his sickle into the earth and harvested the vine of the earth and threw the grapes into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was stomped outside the city, and blood went out from the winepress up to the bridles of the horses, about 1,600 stadia. This is the passage that inspired the words from the battle hymn of the Republic. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. And although they're not stored in this particular picture, but they are harvested and then trampled into wine. 1,600 stadia is a long, long way. It goes in depth up to the bridles of horses. Like, we don't have a length and a width. We only have a length. And without a width, we can't really calculate an area that would be included. And then we can kind of estimate a height by going up to the bridles of horses, which is pretty good height for that kind of fluid. So I don't know how wide we're talking, what kind of area to calculate volume. But even if it's not that wide, it's still a huge volume of blood. The color of purple grape juice is very blood-like. And actually, the word blood was used of grapes in a very natural way, without being morbid. They would talk about the blood of grapes because it was just a natural way to talk about the color of the juice that's produced when you crush the grape. So blood of grapes was a very common phrase, but it's used with a double entendre here to suggest it's not just the blood of grapes, but actual literal blood that is being trampled out from the wine press and going up to the bridles of horses. The idea of rivers of blood actually comes up pretty commonly in the ancient world, and it would even in our world, people talking about rivers of blood. This is like a lake of blood. This is such a vast quantity of either wine or blood, and it has to be metaphorical. I don't know of any commentators, even the most literalistic of them, who thinks that this is an actual occurrence, that somebody is going to see either God himself or an angel in some sort of giant wine press generating this amount of fluid and covering some giant area of the earth with that much blood or wine. It's always taken symbolically, as I think it should. It is a metaphor for the volume of sin that has accumulated. It is meant to convey that. We discount how much our sin really influences things or how bad it is. The kind of volume that's being implied by this verse suggests that the sin is not trivial. It is a huge amount. Every ounce of it represents hurt people, the death of the righteous, betrayals, harm done that shouldn't have been done. All kinds of sin are contributing to this massive volume of blood from the grapes. That is what is going to be concentrated into the wine of God's wrath and then poured out onto the kingdom of the beast. Well, which city are we talking about? Outside the city. Which city is the city? A lot of people will say it's Jerusalem. I think it makes more sense from the context to say it's Babylon, where the angel has declared it will fall. And in fact, Babylon is going to be where this wine is poured out. The implication is that the source of the wickedness is going to receive the consequences of the wickedness by having it poured out on them. And I believe that cycle is centered on Babylon, not Jerusalem in this particular case. Interesting connection to the idea of being stomped. It is the same word that would mean trample, stomped, trampled, same Greek word in both cases, which means it echoes all the way back again to the parable of the two witnesses. And just before that, when in Revelation 11:2, John is told not to measure the outside of the temple because it's been given to the Gentiles and they will trample the whole holy city for 42 months. This is the same word, trampling. So whereas the Gentiles are trampling the righteous, God or the angel on the winepress is trampling the acts of the wicked to create the wine of God's wrath. Thank you again for joining me in our slow walk through the book of Revelation. I look forward to hearing your comments either here on YouTube or in the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group on Facebook. Until we meet again to examine the treasures in the biblical text, may the Lord be with you.